I was just raised on the Holocaust and raised on the idea that sometimes cultures and countries go crazy. And so I was focused on how I might avoid that, how this kind of mental illness is a real problem. And it felt more of a problem to me than earning money for food and shelter, kind of trying to be not a scapegoat, trying to be safe. So I was very much focused on mental illness in a way, and also anxiety, this whole fear that if I do nothing, then one day there could be a backlash against me and my relatives and families. And I feel so grateful in a way to have been in America, which does a great job of protecting freedom. So I was also aware that Einstein had said it has become appallingly obvious that our technology has exceeded our humanity. What that means to me is that we have developed incredible intellectual capabilities, but our emotional and spiritual development has lagged behind. We're not that much different from people 2,000 years ago in terms of our passions and our irrationality, but our technology has developed to such a point that we are now affecting the planet with global warming. We're doing all sorts of things that are really endangering us. And so we have to have this accelerated development in emotional and spiritual capabilities. This was, as a young boy, I was involved in school during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was around 10 years old. And so that was traumatizing in another way, that it wasn't just Jewish people or minorities, it was the whole world we could end up destroying. Einstein said the splitting of the atom has changed everything save our mode of thinking, and thus we drift towards unparalleled catastrophe. So what is this about our mode of thinking? How do we need to change that, and in what ways? And we often look towards spirituality as a way to do that. But when I turned 13, my bar mitzvah was an utter disappointment. I somehow thought I would wake up a different person, and I would have this visitation from God, and I would somehow skip all of adolescence, and all of a sudden I'd be grown up. And I remember lying in bed for a whole week thinking, a lot of people must have got bar mitzvah that same day, because God was taking a while to come around to me. And eventually, nothing happened. And so I recognized, and many of us have, that the traditional rituals that we have available to us don't work as much as they used to. Then I was in the last year of the lottery, and I had to decide what to do about Vietnam. And I was studying Martin Luther King and Tolstoy and Emerson and Thoreau and about nonviolent resistance. And so I decided that I would become a draft resistor, and anticipated going to jail for doing that. I didn't want to run to Canada, but I ended up inadvertently coming up with an incredible strategy, which was I didn't register and absolutely nothing happened. Roughly 60,000 people never registered, and nothing happened. I mean, the computers weren't so big then, and so what I had then was this moral dilemma. Should I turn myself in so that they could put me in jail so I would be an example? And I decided that rather than being a martyr, I'm much too hedonistic if I can avoid that, that creating the positive alternative. And I started looking around in the culture, and I saw LSD. Now, this is Yoko and John, and Tim Leary's in there. LSD became a symbol of cultural rebellion. And I started thinking, why was that? I still believe that LSD made you permanently crazy, that there was something bad that it did to your brain. But what I started to understand was that the mystical experience that people had, it was very interesting for me to see the talk earlier today about the default mode network with flotation, because the latest psychedelic neuroscience research is showing that the classic psychedelics affect the default mode network. And the similarities between flotation and psychedelics, the degrees are different, but that psychedelics really weaken the activity in the default mode network so that our normal ego resting state is weakened, and we get a flood of information. And from our not normal filtering systems, people often have these spiritual senses of connection. So I started realizing that LSD had this potential And when Nixon started saying that Leary was the most dangerous man in America, I started thinking, what is that Leary doing that's working, that's got Nixon so scared? And I believe it's this breakdown of who we think we are. We're not our country, we're not our nationality, our religion, our race, our gender, our sexual orientation. We're part of this human family, we're part of the web of life. And when that's your primary identification, there's a whole set of political implications in the direction of tolerance and compassion. Now, this was also the time when we were going to the moon. My daughter in high school actually did a report on the Apollo, and one of her friends, her friend's grandfather was Michael Collins, who was piloting the ship that Neil Armstrong then went to the moon on, but he never got to the moon. But he said that when he traveled around the world afterwards, what impressed him so much is that people were saying, we did this. And that's what it wasn't the Americans did this, it wasn't the small group of people, it was we as a human race did this. And that was picked up by the last Whole Earth catalog, and we've seen a lot of these images of the Earth from space, and I think we're now engaged in this vast globalization effort, and we're finding that there's a lot of fundamentalism that's being threatened by this globalization. And so for me, the real understanding was that mysticism is the antidote to fundamentalism, and mysticism through psychedelics, this sense of connection. So I started really looking at the Whole Earth catalog, and I found an ad in it for a book by John Lilly. This is my copy, printed, as you can see, 1970. And I read this, and I read this, and I read this, and this was very hard to read. It's very hard to understand. But it was this combination of LSD being taken inside the tank, trying to map out how the brain works as a computer. And this is way before we've made a lot of progress with computers. And so friends and I at college started building our own isolation environments, wearing gloves, wearing goggles, things like that. And we even built a tank out of plywood with plastic liners. And we started doing a fair amount of work inside flotation tanks. And I started thinking the more LSD I took, the faster I would evolve. And it doesn't work that way. So I started having problems. And I went to the guidance counselor at my college. And this was now 1972, and I was lucky enough that he gave me a copy of Realms of the Human Unconscious by Stan Grof, before it was even published, a manuscript copy. And what was in this book was the results of incredible work with LSD to map human consciousness, and also to use the non-ordinary state of consciousness produced by LSD for psychotherapy with the goal of helping people. And once I read this and put it in context with the work that John Lilly had done, and then realized that just as I was waking up to this, the crackdown had happened. The research was shut down all over the world. And so I thought, okay, this is really worth working on. And I started doing my own trips. I dropped out of college for 10 years. I did a fair amount of LSD, but now very intermittently. I worked a lot on the integration process. And I started thinking I need to really talk to some of the experts. And so I decided to get in touch with John Lilly. This is now in the middle 70s. This was Roberta Quist. She was his dolphin trainer. And at a point in time, he had Joe and Rosie, 2 dolphins that he was going to release into the wild. And I was in Sarasota, Florida, and I was able to work with a shark research lab. The dolphins in the Gulf of Mexico are the most well-studied pod in the world. And so I engineered this whole system to bring John out to possibly put his dolphins through Moat Marine Lab and release them there. But he was already moving away from science and into ketamine addiction. And it was really kind of sad. And so we ended up doing an MDMA, he was willing to do an MDMA session, but he kind of saw the damage that he was doing, but he wasn't really able to respond to it. So I felt that there was a difference between him and Stan Grof, who developed what's called holotropic breath work, which is a way to modify your consciousness through hyperventilation. So both of them had these powerful research careers with LSD, with psychedelics. When the crackdown happened, Stan was able to find a way to go forward, but in a more limited way. They were both people way ahead of their time, and I think that the key difference is that Stan was focused on healing, John was focused on knowledge, and John was very impatient. And once the crackdown came, he didn't want to say, you know, now I've got 20, 30 years or whatever it is to bring back, to change the culture, or 50 years as it might be. He just sort of, through kind of a frustration, escaped into sort of a pseudo-spirituality, where Stan went and started doing the research. And so I felt that that's where this focus on healing, and I see that so much in the flotation community, this idea of how do we actually help people. And to see the talks here about veterans with PTSD, about eating disorders, those are both areas that we're looking at very much with psychedelics. And I think that's really where the heart is. And if you can keep that focus on helping people, then it really will help with the mainstreaming. There was one time that I had this crisis in my life, and it's not a crisis that many of us men are unfamiliar with, and it's where we're in love with someone and they say, we want you to be monogamous, and then we say yes, and then we don't. So I had a woman that I was in love with that she was gone out of town for school for a couple months somewhere else. I slept with somebody else, and she broke up with me. And I felt that this was the key to, I needed to undo this, and I felt the most powerful way that I could work on that, to try to understand that, was to take LSD and go in my flotation tank that I had in my house. So I took a large amount of LSD, and I ended up spending 17 hours in the tank. And it was my tank, so I could pee in it. I didn't worry about that. And at one point, I started thinking that that somehow or other that she was in danger, that she was going to be committing suicide, that somehow she was going to hurt herself. There was some phone call that she missed to pick up some of her stuff, and so I kept telling myself that I had to go rescue her. And so you can imagine here, I'm tripping inside the tank, and part of my mind is like, get out of the tank and, you know, go try to rescue her. And I felt like this was, in a way, the closest I've come in my life to psychosis. I knew enough not to get out of the tank and just to sit with that. And it took me a couple hours before I realized that it wasn't really that she couldn't live without me. It was me worried that I couldn't live without her. And once I could sort of go through my projections and accept that, and then acknowledge that I needed to be more willing to say no, or if I don't feel like being monogamous, or more willing to follow through if I say yes, I felt at one point that there was these hooks that were in my cell, that like fish hooks, and that was introjected hate, and that they were like cancer, and that I would get cancer. And once I accepted what I had done, I felt that these hooks kind of released, and then I felt these pulses of light through my body, like x-rays almost, like radiation therapy. And then I felt afterwards that I was able to emerge out of the tank and try to start a new life where I could find love and be a more reliable partner. But I attribute a lot of my subsequent growth and development to the opportunity to have that time in the tank, that extended period of time in this altered state, to sit through these rationalizations and psychosis. So I have a deep respect for the kind of work that can be done in that flotation tank environment with psychedelics. Now, the year after that is where the DEA started trying to criminalize MDMA. I learned about MDMA when it was still legal. And I learned about LSD, the value of it, right after the crackdown. So here I thought, okay, now I know that MDMA is legal, we can introduce it to a lot of people, but it will eventually be smashed because this was being used as ecstasy. There was the rise of Nancy Reagan and just saying no. So we prepared a group of people, we worked on gathering monks and rabbis and various people, psychiatrists at Harvard and others, to start a lawsuit eventually once the DEA moved against MDMA. So here is me. This is 1984, spying on the DEA. This is right before I walk in the door to hand them this request for a hearing with a big DC law firm working pro bono on our behalf. So we had a DEA hearing, we ended up winning. The administrative law judge said MDMA should be Schedule III, available to therapists, but the head of the DEA rejected the recommendation. And so it was clear to me then that the only way back is going to be through the FDA. So in 1986, I started M.A.P.S. And what I'm going to share with you now is the results of 30 years of effort to try to legitimize and have mainstream acceptance for psychedelic psychotherapy. Now, we're right now at what's called the end of phase 2. Within the next 2 weeks, we are going to be submitting data from our phase 2 pilot studies and sending it to the FDA for a discussion about how to move into phase 3. So the first thing that you need is a medical grade drug. So we're having 1 kilogram of, this is actually the factory where we're having the MDMA made. In 1985, I had a kilogram of MDMA made for $4,000 by Dave Nichols at Purdue University. It's the MDMA we still use today, 31 years later. It's an incredibly stable molecule, but it's not medical grade. It's just as pure as what we're going to get, but it doesn't have as much documentation. So now it's going to cost $400,000 for a kilogram. So we have 960 grams of the old MDMA left. And if anybody wants to ever do research with MDMA and flotation tanks or anything, we're giving it away. It's DEA licensed, FDA accepted MDMA. But we're working at a place that if we do succeed, you have to think about scaling up. So this place can scale up if we succeed. Now, a lot of what you're doing, the research that I've seen today is about safety, particularly with the eating disorders. So we had to do safety studies with MDMA, and this is neurocognitive function before and after the placebo, 40 milligrams, 100 milligrams, and 125. And you can see before and after, people actually either get better or they stay the same. So this was to counter propaganda like this. This was on MTV and Oprah. This was SPECT scans. This is supposedly what happens to your brain from MDMA. But this is a graphically manipulated, completely fraudulent image. But a lot of people really believed it. They just put every area that had activity below a certain amount as a whole. But it was very effective in scaring people. We've now treated 107 PTSD patients, PTSD from any cause. Veterans, firefighters, police officers, women and men survivors of childhood sexual abuse and adult rape. This is the overall data to show you. This is the line of 50 on the CAPS, the clinician-administered PTSD scale. Everything above this is moderate to severe. They started out severe, and at 12-month follow-up, they're well below, and most of them, or about over 2/3 of them, no longer even qualify for PTSD. Now, this is showing everybody got MDMA. Either the people get it initially in the double-blind portion of the study, or those that go to the placebo get it what's called open label after they've completed their primary outcome measure. So this disaggregates it a little bit. This is after the 2 blinded sessions, and this is the difference between the people that get therapy with placebo, and this is therapy plus MDMA. This is after the 3rd session. So we're going to actually, as our model for phase 3, we're going to have 3 MDMA